um, there's a lot of need from the community of our students, as well as much broader strategic community of organizations. And we are absolutely thrilled to have Rupert here, dialing in all the way from across the pond, to talk to us about why he wrote this book, how it's being used, and what lessons we can take from the research he's done and the two organizations that he built to actually offer these services, these consulting services to companies. So what I would like to do at this point is to invite Rupert to join me in this conversation. And my very first question, by the way, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or in a chat. We will be monitoring the chat as well as the Q&A section of this podcast, of this webinar. And we hope that this is going to be not just a lecture, but an engaging conversation about the topic that we care so much about. All right, so Rupert, welcome to NYU Book Launch Series.
Thanks, Anna. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Why don't we start with kind of a statement of purpose? What brought you to this topic, and why did you decide? We know that book writing takes a lot of your energy and time, but why did you decide to write on data-driven organizational design?
So my foray into organization design started, I'm going to give my age away, in the late 1990s. I was on a flight on Friday afternoon, at sort of 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. I was told you need to be in South Africa, Johannesburg, for a 9 o'clock kickoff meeting on doing organization design. And I'd never done any organization design work before or anything. So I printed off all the materials and read. I had to buy a suitcase. I bought a suitcase because I didn't have a proper suitcase to fly, and read like crazy about organization design and everything else on as I was flying to South Africa on the all-nighter. And I remember, I think the movie The Matrix was on. As well. That's where I saw The Matrix. So I was kind of reading org design and watching the movie The Matrix, anyway, got changed in the restroom and at the airport, and off I went to a meeting to do an organization design project, and from that moment on, was busy with it. I did lots of other things as a management consultant, but it was organization design. I ended up rewriting the method. But I was just frustrated with the technology we were using, which is PowerPoint and Excel. Any of you who have done organization design using PowerPoint and Excel will know it's very, very time consuming and manual process. And I don't think you can do the work properly, actually, if you're using those technologies. So I created a business and developed a software platform called OrgView to help people do organization design. And that was around, we started the platform, writing the platform in 2010. And it was actually when I was in New York, believe it or not, I just got my first bit of funding, and I was speaking to an investor. We were in, I think it was Soho House, so a very trendy part of New York. And I was going on and on about all design and the platform that I wanted to build and all this kind of stuff. And he said, "Why don't you write a book?" And then he did something really annoying. He plugged an idea in my head. He said, when there wasn't a thing called customer relationship management. It wasn't a thing, but someone coined the term CRM and wrote a book on it, and the rest was history. So that was kind of like a bit of a gauntlet. And I thought, well, there's no market for this. People are doing it really badly. I did quite a bit of research as to what the methods were, and I did a lot of reading. So particularly Jay Galbraith and the STAR model and everything else. And I just everything that I could read, everything I could find. I'm like, the method was too much focus on the strategy, which is relevant. Too much focus on operating model design, and none of it really got to the how. So I thought to myself, if I would pick this up and then I have to go and execute and make it happen, I don't know how that's going to work. And equally, it doesn't get down to the detailed design. So it doesn't get down to understanding the roles and how that fits in the work. And it was missing like the impact that it has on the employee. And I think if you do organization design well and properly, you can actually make the work more motivating and the role more motivating. Because if you look at the work of that Daniel Pink and Drive, there are three things that drive motivation in the workplace: purpose, mastery, and autonomy. To me, those are organization design concepts, because purpose is, what's the purpose, not just of the organization, what's the purpose of the role? Why do the role? What are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve? What does success look like? Autonomy is, what are you accountable for? That's an organization design issue. And mastery, do you have the skills and competencies to be excellent and effective at doing that? And if you get that right, if you read work on like positive psychology and the concept of flow, you try and get the role design so you can be in that flow channel. And equally, getting it wrong, which I've witnessed a lot, when people just go and do this badly, it's so disruptive both to the organization and to human beings. And I talk about it in the second edition. I call it horror stories, because the one thing when I'm in person lectures, so this is unfortunate we're not together, but in person, the thing that people come up to me the most is coming with stories about where it's done badly and done wrong, and then the human consequence. Because at the end of the day, there's a human being who's got, when we move boxes around and do things and say, oh, we're going to restructure, those are humans that have egos, that have families, that have lives, and it can be destroyed. And for some people, that leads to suicides, and it leads to murders, and it leads to all sorts of horrendous things. And the number of people who have come up to me and told me these stories is untrue. So I think there's a moral duty to do this work well, and too often it's done badly. And so for lots of reasons, I thought I had to write a book, and that I did the writing in the first edition in 2013 and 2014, so quite a long time ago. And so now, that's 6 years of learning, improvement, and refining. And so the second edition is really about this. Namely, there was a whole bunch of stuff in the first edition that I thought was interesting and useful, and not one person ever asked me about. So I wrote, there was a course at the London School of Economics on multi-criteria decision making, and I thought it was really interesting. So I condensed that course into 3 pages. It almost broke me, Anna, and it was very complicated technically. And in all the years that the first edition was up, no one ever asked about it. No one commented. And I thought, you know what, that's probably a waste. So I took that out. I took a whole bunch. I took a third of the chapters out, and that's now going into a new book. So you'll have to have me back. The new book that I'm now busy writing is called OP&A, Organizational Planning and Analysis. So I decided the first edition was 2 books. So, and then just the other thing is, I'm just a sucker for punishment. I just, if you see a mountain, you want to climb it. It's a little bit like that as well.
That's wonderful. And I know that you are an Ironman triathlete. So that sounds like a challenge you will take. I want to share, before we get into the presentation, that there will be specifics here for those of you on the call. I want to share a metaphor or a quote that I like to use when I talk about data-driven approach to org design. And that comes from Harvard Business Review. It says, if strategy is the blueprint for building organizations, metrics are the concrete, wood, dry wood, and bricks. So I think in some ways it manages to capture what you are saying. And I think in some ways where a lot of our educational approaches also fall through is we tend to teach at the strategy level, and I hear it from my students, but we rarely get down into the trenches and really show our students how this work is actually being done.
It's very interesting.
All right, so do you, I know you have your slides. Shall we get started? And if you could give us sort of a walkthrough your approach and what you do, and maybe a little bit of an insight into what your company, the company that you co-founded, what you offer as a solution to companies.
I've got a lot of, yeah. Great, no, I'll do that. And please just stop me in between. Let's make it a discussion. Don't want to be a slave to getting to the end of the. So,
Oops. Okay.
can you guys hear me?
We have a little bit of a connection issue. So if you want to get off, we can project your slides from our end if that's easier.
Let me try again. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So just about myself briefly, I'm originally from New Zealand. Grew up on a sheep station in a small part of New Zealand. An economist by education. I was a management consultant, and then I founded Concentra. Concentra is an analytics firm, and from that we built the platform OrgView. So we have two parts of the business. We have TrueQ, which is an analytics, pure analytics, and then OrgView is org design and workforce planning platform. I've raised money in 2018, $61 million, and I also love coaching rugby and doing other silly things like doing Ironmans and things. I obviously like punishment. I like to punish myself. The book, here it is. I think I'll jump through. So the book is broken into 4 sections. The first section really talks about an introduction to a data-driven organization design. So it talks a lot about the challenges. Biggest challenge really being politics and dealing with politics, and also people designing around people and not designing around the work and the strategy and what needs to happen. So, and setting the foundations, both in terms of data, but also philosophy, that an organization is core to executing strategy. It is not as simple as sticks and boxes and who reports to who, but it's an interconnected set of components of the work that needs to be done, the objectives and the competencies to do that work. From there, we move into macro design, and that's really the operating model. So if you're going to choose building metaphors, that's where you say, what does the building look like? Is it, how many stories is it going to be? Is it full of glass? There's high level. It's understanding the design criteria and principles and thinking about options and different structural options to meeting those design criteria, and then making a decision and writing a business case. So that's where you've got the high level, how it's going to work in the framing of the organization. Then you move into the micro detailed design, and that's where you understand the objectives that need to be done, you optimize the work and understand accountabilities, not just at the functional level, but all the way down to the role, and you're doing role level design here. This is where you work out right sizing. So how many different positions are needed, and by each of your key organizational dimensions. So by, for instance, geography, by product, and you pull it together and you define that structure. Now, when you've got the macro model design done, you've got the micro detailed design done. Think of the detailed design as the HVAC. It's like, how does everything work? You're calculating everything, but it's still, you've not actually done anything. It's still theoretical. So making it real is the execution. It's how you're planning. It's doing the impact. It's understanding what is the impact on the organization going to be, on the people, on the individuals. What is the change, and understanding that change. It's doing the talent slating. So who gets which position and why, and managing that entire process, and then managing the entire improvement. And because an organization is never static. There's not a one and done. Too often people talk about an as is and to be model, like it's 2 photos, but actually the to be is constantly evolving and changing. And so in making it real, it's managing that ongoing optimization. So that's the broad structure. in the second edition, we've added a case study called Hukupa. Hukupa is Polynesian for North Star, or maybe Southern Star, but anyway, the central, and it was used in navigation. So that's a case study that runs through the book, again, to try and make it as practical as possible and bring these things to life. So that's just on the Cooper example. I won't dwell on this too much. So the organization, you start with your strategy, and your organization system is there to execute that strategy so you can drive the performance of your organization. And there is a strong feedback loop between the organization system and the performance of the organization. And if you're not performing the way you need to, you go back to the organization system, say, why is it not doing what we need to do? How do we tweak? Sometimes you need to have strategic shifts. And when you do that, then there's a larger change to your organizational system. But your strategy shouldn't change too often. It should, stand the test of time relative to the amount of changes within that organization system. So the question is, what's inside the box? 6 things. You start with your people. And in Orgview, that's where we normally start. We take in your people data and we understand who you have, where they are, etc. And this can be permanent employees as well as temporary employees and things like that. And think of your people as supplies. From a workforce planning context, it's the supply of labor. Your demand is the number of positions were broken into roles. And one thing that I've observed in most organizations, they don't have clarity on the difference between a role and a position. Think of a role as the job description. And that is made up of a set of targets, the objectives, the results that need to be achieved, the activities, the work that needs to be done, and the competencies, the skills, the behaviors that are required to be effective at doing that work so you can achieve those outcomes, you can achieve your objectives. A role fits within what we call a role grid. So you have role families. So you might have IT or finance, and then or subfamilies, so control. And then within that, you have your actual different roles. So you might have sales rep and sales manager. For each role, there could be one or more positions. So the role CEO, there's almost always only one position. So that's a one-to-one relationship between role and position. But very often there are lots of different positions. So if you think of sales, you might have dozens, you might have hundreds of sales reps, and a position is specified. So it has a scope and a geography and a reporting relationship. And then people are slated into positions, and that changes over time. So this is also the data. When we talk about data driven, this is everything I'm showing here is data. Now, people have actuals. They achieve certain outcomes. They do work. So you want to understand how much work they're doing. And are they doing the right work? And are they enjoying that work? So we ask both quantitative and qualitative data about the activities. And then they possess competencies. They have skills and behaviors. And from that, when we have a target and we have an actual, we want to understand the gap. What is the delta between the target and the actual? So for instance, we take the skills. What skills are they missing? And that then can inform things like L&D or talent acquisition strategy as well. So this is this 6 pieces of data. I call it RPP, role, positions, people, mapped to OAC, objectives, activities, competencies.
So Rupert, you did mention jobs, and you do have skills here. As you know, the big conversation in organizations today is whether it makes more sense to be talking about skills and break down the roles and positions into skills and really operate at the skills level. What is your response? How do you factor in? How do you participate in that conversation with this framework?
So we in this framework, we're defining for each role the target skills. So we're at the skills level, and we build maybe, I'm not sure if I've got a slide on it. I can jump to it. So I can show it a little bit. So for each role, you have target proficiency. So we have a taxonomy of skills and behaviors, so competencies, with proficiency targets and weightings for each. And so in the middle is that. And then you have actual, so employee self-assessment, management feedback, third party. And from that, you have a gap. And in that, we can then build a talent marketplace. So for each role, we can say how many people have got the skills required for that role. So if you take the chief financial officer, the person in the role, which is the blue, they're a 93% match. So in this fake example, Pearl Rocha, if I can read that correctly, is the chief financial officer. But if I look across, the highest match is Reese Harris, who's the CEO. There's no one else who's actually close to having the skills required to be a CFO. In the world of agile, which we work in more and more, and I see Donna's on as well. People are moving around positions all the time. So you have agile positions, and those positions might exist for only 3 months. And so understanding the skills that people have is really important in the gap. And so this is one visualization. This is using data to try and bring that to life. And from this, if you see, well, which people could be successes, or which people have the skills, or if there's a gap, if your chief finance officer is at 93%, there's a 7% delta there. Which competencies do they need training in and support in, or augmenting? And so that then becomes a conversation. So, and this is all data, and it's all linked using this model.
Thank you. Thank you. We can continue. And please, everyone, write your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, but very interesting. Thank you.
And it's much more fun for me answering questions than being a slave to the PowerPoint.
We will ask you questions for sure.
It's great. So then within the introduction, so one of the things is data. And so the most important thing when we're doing analysis and using data is the questions that we ask. All too often, people say, what data do I have? And then produce a dashboard or report without thinking, what questions am I trying to answer in the first place? So on the left, we start with the hypotheses and the questions. Then I won't bore everyone with the process of how we go through that. But if you look at point number 7, which might be a little bit small, it's about getting to action. Because if we don't do something with what, we might answer a hypothesis, but what are we going to do about it? Because we don't, it's not what we know that matters. It's about what we do with what we know that counts. And if that's important, you probably want to repeat that analysis. So then you can start monitoring it and tracking, did my action actually have an impact? So this is the foundation around how we do this. And then in the book, I describe how to think about this. So properties or fields in a relationship database are used to calculate measures, which are analyzed by dimensions to generate insight for action. So for instance, the properties that, the raw data will be date of birth and say retirement age. The measures, average age to retirement and proportion of employees within 5 years of retirement. I dimensionalize, so a dimension might be by function, by grade, and we call it dimensionalize to analyze. So I slice that, and then I can get insight. So for instance, 17% of the workforce will reach retirement age within 3 years, but 35% of senior managers or 42% of the managers in finance. So you start breaking down and slicing. So it's just a framework for dealing with data and how to answer questions.
So Rupert, if I could ask you a question first on the question about the questions. And it's really, really important to get to the outcome. But if you could just give us an insight as to how do you validate the questions with the organizations you're working with?
So the first thing is, what is your strategy? What are you trying to achieve? And then from that, you say, well, you can start asking sorts of questions. What's going to stop us from getting there? Why? What are the risks? If I'm thinking in this instance about retirement or churn, I'm not going to ask a question, what is our level of churn? I want to ask the question, what is causing churn? If I'm going to ask the question, why do we, are we not, you might want to talk about diversity and inclusion. Asking the question, do we lack diversity is not as interesting as what can make certain groups succeed and become more senior. So an example of this, with one client, we were looking at diversity at the top of the organization, and there weren't enough females in senior leadership positions, but some females were in senior leadership positions. And so the question is, how did they get there? What career paths did they follow that predicted that they were going to be successful and reach? And what career paths did others who didn't become successful? And so with that, we did career path mapping and predictive analytics on who would arrive. Now that this was in TrueQ, not OrgView, but it's the same process. And we found that females who had commercial experience were more likely to become senior managers. So and so then it gets to action, because I know if I answer that hypothesis, I can do something about it. So then it's useful insight. And so with that, how do we get more females into commercial roles early in their career? And then the monitoring is important, because if I decide that, am I succeeding? Am I getting more females into commercial? And then is that, now this is obviously, it takes a long time to have an impact on this kind of thing, but you still want to see that that's working. So that's an example.
Thank you.
And so it's the quality of the question really dictates the quality of the impact of the analysis. And all too often I find that people just go off and just do crunch numbers without that fundamental. Another way of it is we build hypothesis trees, and we discuss them when we think about it, and what would the impact be about, and how, and so that's a debate that you have with clients, and then you prioritize them, and you work it through. And to me, that's a continuous journey. You're always that never stops, really.
Thank you. We have half an hour left. Maybe we can spend 15 minutes now going through some of the highlights. Sure. and then we'll continue with the discussion.
So with macro design, so the 4 steps, key is to articulate the strategy. All too often, the strategy is poorly articulated. And from that, you want to define design criteria. Design criteria are used to decide between different options, and design principles are always true no matter what the option is. So that's a list of measures that you want to achieve. So an example of a design principle is there's only the single point of accountability, whereas a design criteria might be innovation. We need to innovate faster, or we need to become more cost efficient. And the thing about design criteria is they're often in conflict with each other. And so I don't know, I never have a perfect design. All I have is a way of optimizing for design criteria. So what you do is you develop those options, and there are different tricks and different frameworks for that. And then you map the high level work and accountabilities for each option. So you would know how that's going to work in practice, which we call how will it work in practice. So an example of that is not just mapping accountabilities, but it's mapping who gives what work to whom and who gets what. So you understand the flow, the value chain, and the flow of the work, and then you make a decision. So just a range of things, for instance, what the give-get matrix is, and examples of how you map the work, and different types of frames. And these are all screenshots from the book, or parts of the book. So, just different frames and way of working that through. But also down to how do you write a business case? So in the business case, what are the section headers? And we have two examples, one from her Cooper of a business case mapped out for you. So that, and this is actually really helpful. So if you know this is the business case I need to write, which is, what's your recommendation, summary rationale? What are we trying to achieve? What are the must keep strengths? What's the case? The case for change has to be really, really compelling. What is it? And what makes a compelling case for change, etc., all the way through. I'm just conscious of time. Then we move on to the detailed design. And this is really where this kind of the meat and potatoes of DDOD is. So understanding the objectives, understanding role design, optimizing the work, working through the competencies and pulling it all together, including right sizing. And I'll just jump through a few examples. Roles are designed, positions are planned within design roles. So there's in the book, there's a whole glossary of terms as well, because language is really important. And understanding the difference between a role and a position is really important, like I've already said, and then people for those. So this is an example of a role grid. So each dot here is a role by the level of work, and actually leaned in very heavily into Elliot Jacques' thinking on the requisite organization in this. So broadly speaking, according to his theory, there are typically 6 to 7 levels of work in an organization, depending on the scale of the organization. And that's all driven by the impact of the work, the complexity, and the time horizon over which decisions are made. So a level 1 role, you'll make the time horizon of what you're making decisions is hourly, daily. It's sort of in the moment. So if you think of a salesperson in a shop, they're doing transactional work, whereas someone at a level 2, time discretion is a quarter, it's 3 months. And so the amount of variables and complexity they're dealing with increases. And so what the role grid does is it places each role into the role families and the level of work. And you can see, and this is a screenshot from OrgView, and you can drag and drop and create these roles, and that's part of the design process. And roles have accountabilities. So we use RAD. I don't like RACI. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with RACI. RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consult, and inform. The problem is a lot of people find it really difficult to distinguish between responsible and accountable. And, I've spent hours and days and weeks working through RACI grids and saying, is this role do they need to be consulted or informed? And arguing about that just feels like a complete waste of time. The person responsible should know who they should consult and inform. So I don't think it adds a lot of value. What we use is RAD, which is who's responsible, and but starts with them. A is for approve, because if it's a decision maker, who's got veto power or needs approval. And D is for do, who's actually doing the work. But if you want to use RACI, then use RACI, but it's also what proportion of time should you be spending. So with that, when we get actual data, we can say for each role and position, are they spending the amount of time? Are they doing the work that we think that they should be doing? And what work are they not doing? And there was an example here with a mining company where this actually led to radical changes in how they managed health and safety, because they had blast engineers doing the wrong work and that can be a big issue if they're not doing the right work. That makes sense. So again, this is then looking at the delta between the target and the actual and the match there. I'm going to jump through to this. So right sizing. So I talked about competencies. Right sizing. It's how many positions do we need for each role by what key organization dimension? So a key organization dimension could be geography, could be business unit or product, it could be function, and certain positions are fixed. So CEO, CHRO, CFO. Sometimes, like R&D, you just have an incremental percent change that you want to make. So in the Hakuba case study, we want to increase it by 30%, say. Or when clients are moving into, say, APAC, saying we're going to increase the investment into APAC by 40%. Many times you have drivers. Drivers are based off productivity. So, for instance, what sales do we need to achieve? What's the productivity of each sales rep? So how much does each sales rep sell? And you can calculate. It's just very simple maths. You can calculate how many account managers are needed, sales reps are needed, and then the ratio is, for instance, you might have a ratio of sales managers to sales reps of say 8 or 10. So it's based on those drivers. Activity is when you're looking at the work and you pull the levers, which I jumped over, and you say, well, what work should be outsourced? What work should be consolidated? What work can we automate? What work should we stop doing? What work are we not doing that we should be doing and we need to invest in? And the last method, which full disclosure you can't do in AuGview, is modeling. So that's where you've got system dynamics like queuing effects and things like that. And so it's more complex. So you use more dynamic modeling to calculate the size. So I love inventing acronyms. So this one's called FIDRAM for understanding how to right size. And then we move into making it real. So that's slating which person should get what position, and not leaving people behind. So when you're going through large scale restructurings or growth, and it's very easy, if this is done in Excel, it becomes a bit of a quagmire. So we want to know each person, where have they been slated or not, and have they been confirmed, and what is the impact, and then you put a D&I lens on these things as well. You say, well, are we being sexist or ageist or something like that? And there's a position life cycle as well for managing these positions on an ongoing basis. And lastly, within it, it's what does the organization need to be for managing this? So in finance, 75% of finance function is day-to-day backward looking. So credit control, accounting, financial reporting, treasury, and that is needed. You cannot run a business without finance operations and financial control. But 25% of the finance function is doing financial planning and analysis, FP&A. That's budgeting and forecasting. That's optimizing the financial structures. That's looking at new projects and investment criteria and hurdle rates and all these sorts of things. That's FP&A, and that's the forward-looking planning and asking what-if questions. What if we wanted to enter China? How would we do it? What would it cost? What if we were going to increase the R&D? What would the return be, and how would that look? In HR, you have also HR operations. That's employee lifecycle management, talent acquisition, employee onboarding, comp and ben, L&D. All of that is absolutely fundamental. You don't have a business if you don't have good HR operations. However, 98 to 100% of HR is focused and solely focused on HR operations. And this is one of the big issues. So we believe, and our clients believe, that there has to be, or many of our clients believe, there has to be a new function, which is organizational planning and analysis. And that's doing the org design, what I'm talking through. It's doing the workforce. Organization design morphs into workforce planning. So as you can see, the right sizing discussion, I need to right size from an org design. But when I make that temporal ongoing, I start moving into workforce planning. It's the people analytics. So the example I gave around trying to say, well, what are the career paths for females to reach senior leadership positions? That kind of analysis sits within OP&A. And so this function needs to be built, this muscle needs to be built in organizations. And a big part of why I've written the book DDOD, to go back right to your first question, Anna, and why I'm writing the next book called OP&A is to really lay that out, so that it's clear, and also the case for change for why OP&A is so important, so that you can make that business case for your organizations to get the resources needed to build this function. And I believe, like FP&A as a function is not a shared service, is not a center of excellence. It's a function that reports into the CFO, and it's crucial for driving a business forward. And OP&A, I believe, should be the same. So that's my last slide. We've got.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions, which I think if you could click out of the presentation and just be on the screen. And I think they're related in some ways. As you know, I mean, first of all, to do this work at the organizational level, especially with multinational companies with so much complexity involved, you can't do it with a spreadsheet, right? So what are the technologies to support this type of granular planning that you outlined for us?
So the vast majority of what I talked about, that's what OrgView, which is a software platform, was built for. And it was designed on the back of the methodology. So I would say that the book came first and then the software.
Okay. So you actually developed the tools to help you do this work. Correct.
That's right. Now, there are certain things that I talked about that OrgView can't do. So some of the more sophisticated analytics that I was talking about. So if you're using techniques like random forest, for instance, and the way you want to structure the data, so the career path example that I talked through, the OrgView is not built to answer those kind of questions. Our sister technology, TrueQ, is where we can use that, or other business intelligence platforms. And then on top of that, you've got visualization software like Power BI or Tableau. You have Python to do a lot of the statistics, or R, and there's a whole range of different technologies for that. So I would say, in the broader scope of organizational planning and analysis, OrgView does a lot, but it doesn't do all. The org design component, and the workforce planning part, that's where a platform like OrgView is used.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll go with first question from Roy Altman, who is saying that, how does this work for organizations that are moving into the agile operating model? And then based on that, should the question specifically is, should rising to the senior management level be the goal, or should there be engagement in multiple initiatives based on diverse competencies?
Okay, so there's a couple of questions in this. So
yes.
Let's go with implementing agile.
Yes.
So it's a lot of, more and more. So the first thing I'd say is agile's been around for a very long time, but for whatever reason, outside of software development, it's really picking up a lot of momentum. So we have actual several banks in North America implementing Agile as examples and different industries outside of software. And the thing to think about is when I talked about positions, a position has a life cycle. In many instances, that position might be around forever. In Agile, it's not. It's there for a period to deliver a certain piece of work. And people might not be in that position permanently. They might be in it 50% of the time, or so it's just that the work is more dynamic, and and also how people the other thing here is you're not structured into your say functional families. You're sitting in two places. You're sitting in your mission teams where you're put together in a multi-criteria team. So you know, if I use software, you'll have UX, you'll have product managers, you'll have developers and QA, and all of those people are coming together to deliver something at the end of a series of sprints. So you might have 6 sprints of 2 weeks each, 12 weeks, and that's a delivery train. And at the end of that time, you ship, you have the outcome. And then that person the UX person, designer might be on one mission team for a small proportion of time than somewhere else. And then they have multiple reporting lines. So in Orgview, we have the design of people sitting in multiple places simultaneously, as well as moving around and work. And I think with Donna and her team will be giving access to Orgview and actually a lot of stuff on this agile thinking as well. We can go deeper on that probably at another time. Should raising to senior management be the goal, or should being engaged in multiple initiatives based on diverse competencies be emphasized? So I think should raise. I don't think it's an or. It's going to be an either or an and. In my mind, not everyone wants to become a senior manager. Sometimes many organizations have multiple career tracks. So some are a management track and some are technical tracks. And not everyone is going to be great at managing people, and they're amazing at other things. And that needs to be recognized. So it certainly shouldn't be the goal for everyone, would be and being engaged in multiple initiatives. So that also depends. Certain roles, no, you're just running a process and you shouldn't be involved in multiple initiatives. And other roles, absolutely. I think it's a horses for courses, and there's not one rule. And this is probably a slight issue in this field. I didn't talk about the sins of right sizing and how bad right sizing is done, but one of the examples of how you do bad is what I call the magic number. So just picking a number, so 8's a magic number. It's the span of control that people feel that should be there on average, and just applying that. Sometimes 8 is right, many times it's not. And so you have to think it through. Some roles, yes, multiple initiatives, others, no. What's right for your organization, and what you're trying to achieve. So hopefully that answers that question.
And then the question from Mona Lisa is around, I think it's connected to agility. So with pandemic, with these sharp turns, 180s, et cetera, it seems like everything had to change overnight, or a lot of it. So how does this particular very structured approach lend itself to a much more dynamic, much more disruptive environment?
Yeah. So I think the pandemic highlighted the importance of being able to do this. It highlighted the fact that you need to run multiple scenarios. We did 8 different reforecasts during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had 3 different scenarios that we modeled out because we just didn't know. And if your data is structured in the right place, then it means that you can operate at speed and you can create different scenarios and answer different and develop different options. But I think the pandemic's highlighted that, but more broadly, if you're not moving and developing and growing or changing as fast as the market, you're going to be in decline, and eventually you're going to fail. And the amount of time that organizations stay in the Dow Jones index or the Fortune 500, but whatever you want, is decreasing. I think it's decreased from something like 30 years to 18 in the last few decades. And so you have to be constantly evolving as fast as your market's evolving, and your market is evolving rapidly. And so I think the pandemic was a useful reminder and catalyst, but it just highlights just how important this work is.
Thank you very much. And in closing, Rupert, what will be your recommendations to people who want to be doing org design, but maybe not in the consulting role? Some will in the consulting capacity, but others in strategic HR positions. So how do those roles connect to these tools, and what's the best pathway to learn?
So I would hope that people start populating the OP&A function and helping the business do this. I think it's unfair to ask an HR business partner who's got such a broad remit to do all of this, and they often fail because it's just too broad. So you have to work in partnership with the OP&A leader. This is a set of techniques and skills and that I believe should be owned in-house inside an organization. I don't think this is too important. It shouldn't be outsourced to management consulting firms. Yes, leverage management consulting firms for their expertise and to augment your team, because that's often needed. But this is a muscle that organizations of a certain scale just will need. And it's an interesting career. And what I will say is, for your students, our clients are desperate for talent in this space. They're hunting for it, they're looking for it, and it's a different type of skill set. It's more the mindset of that the FP&A function has. We did a study with Wharton a few years ago, and of their grads, something like 15% went into finance and 0.4% went into HR. Their master's students. That, by the way, that wasn't an official academic paper or anything, so I don't know how broadly we can quote that, but that was a piece of work the students did for us, and that was very interesting. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more talent going into the field of HR to be able to do the OP&A work. And it's exciting work. You impact strategy of the business and how it performs. It's really interesting work, and you can make jobs better. You can improve the quality of the work that people do. You can give them autonomy and help them get mastery. All these things have big impacts on the lives of people as well.
And I think you demonstrated it very well, the complexity of the approach, the analytics required, the mastery of technology that will assist you to do it at scale. And we're certainly having this in our curriculum, and there's more and more growing demand and understanding. And I think the pandemic actually made it even clearer that the old way of looking at organizations is no longer valid. And I want to finish on my favorite quote from your book, Rupert. It is very brief, and it says, "What all organizations need is a new way to see themselves." And I think that's kind of it's a poetic way to say that looking at organizations through data is a very new way and very much needed way of of living in organizations that we currently have. So thank you very much. Thank you, Rupert, very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone who participated. We have the information on the book in the chat here from Nicole, and we will have our next book launch in December. And we have Rob Cross with his latest book on with the use of ONA in organizations to share it with us. But at this point, thank you so much, Rupert. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, the team who helped us make it happen.